had imbalances in this particular place, but that particular word doesn't sit well with the nature of the question. So we change it to regional variations. I want you all to keep that in mind. So let's discuss the question. Where does this question fare, by the way? It comes under governance of GS2. What are the prerequisites that I have to keep in mind when I answer a governance based question? One, I have to invoke the article which is related to that particular case. For example, mental health more often than not is related to human dignity. So you could put in Article 21 in somewhere in your answer. That is one thing. And the second thing which is important for governance based answer is the usage of acts or the legislations or the policies that we have in order to densify your answer. These things, when you put in your answer, it is going to substantiate the opinion which you are going to give. That is one thing you have to keep in mind. So these are the two things, basic prerequisites for us to keep in mind when we write a governance based answer. So I'll read out the question for you all. I'll do it briefly because we have done it yesterday as well. And then what do? We convert this particular question into the usual introduction, body and the conclusion format. This introduction, body, conclusion is going to be the skeleton of my answer. And once I have the skeleton in my mind, I'll go forward and see how the sample answer has been written and pick up any holes in that particular answer, see if the person has written well or not. So the question is, a multi-pronged strategy is the need of the hour to correct the regional variations in the prevalence of mental disorders in India. Discuss. So basically what it's trying to say is that the prevalence of mental disorders in India is varied in different parts of the country. In certain areas of the country, the disorders are many. The quantum of disorders plaguing the people is quite a bit, whereas other areas are not much affected by mental disorders. So basically there is a regional variation in the mental disorders that we have. So in order to handle this regional variation, in order to handle the mental disorders as such, you need to have a multi-pronged strategy. So that is what it says. So because it is asking me to discuss about the strategy, I know I definitely have to talk about the strategy. So I'll immediately put that down in my body of the answer. Multi-pronged strategy. Okay. So I definitely have to talk about the strategy. Having said that, the question is starting out with a premise. It says that there are regional variations in the prevalence of mental disorders. So it is better for me to first establish the regional variations. Okay. So these two things are really important. They form the skeleton of my answer. They are going to tell me what, look, there are regional variations in the prevalence of mental disorders in the country, and you have to take so and so measures, and these measures have to be a multi-pronged set of measures. Why? Because this is a multi-dimensional problem. And how do I establish it? Therefore I have to talk about the impact of this variation, impact of these mental disorders as such, impact of this regional variation in mental disorders as such, and then I move forward to talk about a multi-pronged strategy. So this is going to be addressed only briefly. This is going to act as that value addition or enrichment factor in my answer. These two things are really what have been asked in the answer, and the conclusion is going to be a 1 or 2 line conclusion because this is just a 10 marker. And then how do we start the introduction? One good way to start the introduction is to talk about or summarize what mental disorders are. Nobody has real clarity about what mental disorders are. For example, autism, is that a mental disorder? Parkinson's disease, is that a mental disorder or a physical disorder? So basically you could start off by basically defining what mental disorders are, mention schizophrenia, mention bipolar disorder, mention mental illnesses and so on. In that way you will tell the examiner that these are the issues, these are the things that I have in mind when I talk about mental illnesses, and I know what mental illnesses really are, and in that way you will be able to establish a connect between yourself and the examiner. So the introduction, body, conclusion format is set for this particular question. We will move forward and see a sample answer and see how it has been written. Okay. So, see, mental disorders are the problems of the mind which include wide-ranging diseases like bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, autism, etc. Okay, so this is a decent introduction. In fact, it is a nice introduction. But if I were writing this answer, I would have mentioned Article 21. How do I mention Article 21? So basically, I would extend this by saying The mental disorders are the problems of the mind. Examples, so and so. These hurt the human dignity because of the way in which they affect the human life and the quality of human life guaranteed by Article 21. Okay. In that way, I'll be able to squeeze in the article in my introduction. And the key is to do this whole thing in 3 or 4 lines and move forward to the body of the answer. He's talking about prevalence of mental disorders in India. Oh, that seems to be interesting, because what has been asked, the premise is about the prevalence of regional variations in mental disorders. You have to strictly and clearly look at the mandate of the question, and let's see if he has done that. See, he's talking about regional variations. So in order to move forward to regional variations, first he is trying to put up the prevalence of mental disorders in India. So basically what he is trying to tell us is that first I'll talk about the mental disorders briefly, and then I'll move forward to talk about the regional variations which have been the premise of the question, and then we'll move forward to look at the rest of the answer. So what is the prevalence? He is quoting a report here, India state level disease burden report. It says that in every 7 Indians there is one person who is depressed or has some kind of mental illness and so on. So he is basically putting up a fact here. This is good. Rural anxiety levels have been found to be more compared to urban areas, as pointed out by NFHS4. These two are really good points considering the facts they have, because they have been quoting reports. One of them is a recent report, and an NFHS4 has been in use for the past 2 or 3 years. Okay, so this is basically a good value addition. Let's see if he addresses regional variations well. He says there are higher depressive disorders in southern states like Tamil Nadu, Goa and Kerala. This seems to be a generic point. In fact, it is not, because this has been pointed out by state level disease burden report. This report also talked about this. He should have pointed that out. Otherwise, it's easy for me to say that there are higher depressive disorders in so and so states. What am I substantiating there? I need some kind of fact to substantiate it, right? Because he has written 4 points here and he has substantiated none of them. Higher rates of suicide in the south. Regions of great farm distress have seen multiple mental disorders and suicides. Okay. Areas prone to conflicts like insurgency, Naxalism, etc. face greater mental illnesses. Okay. These are basically reasonable points. These seem to be logical points, but these two are facts. They have been pointed out by the same report. He should have quoted that report. And what happens when you quote a report in one of your points is that it gives legitimacy to other points as well. Because once I read a point here which is talking about a report, I move to the next point and I believe you. I believe you when you tell me that the regions of farm distress have seen multiple mental disorders and suicides. Then I will believe you. Otherwise, anybody could write all these points. Anybody could put up these points. Like for example, I could say northeast areas have higher rates of suicide. How am I going to substantiate it? So you need some kind of substantiation, right? So when you write 4 or 5 continuous opinions, it is better to substantiate one of them every now and then. Okay, so he has talked about regional variations, and then he's skillfully talking about the impact, and he is doing so in such a small space, which is a good thing. Okay, because that has not been directly asked by the question. He says there is social stigma. These people are unable to find jobs. Loss in dignity of life. Article 21, guaranteed by Article 21. Higher pressure on South Indian health expenditure. Okay, problems of sexual assault on mentally ill women, etc. Okay, so this is basically a good value addition to my answer. But what should be done is that he has to create a flowchart which says multi-dimensional problem and then multi-pronged strategy. Then the answer becomes quite logical. So what I am trying to say is that the impact created by mental disorders is this, and this impact, if you see, it is quite multidimensional. Like poverty is multidimensional, as pointed out by several reports like World Bank, IMO, etc. And similarly, so this is a multidimensional problem that I have established. Because it is a multidimensional problem, I have to use a multi-pronged approach. And what do I mean? What do I mean by that? Multi-pronged approach is that which approaches a problem from different directions. If there is a problem, you have to address the problem from different sides. You have to use economics, you have to use politics, you have to use schemes, you also have to use social awareness. Like all these dimensions are taken into account in order to address that problem. Such a strategy is called as multi-pronged strategy. So what is the strategy he has in his mind? International efforts like UN Convention on rights of disabled, etc., must be implemented. Okay, mad or mental carelessly. This is a good point. This is basically a societal point, a societal based point, and it is a nice enrichment to my answer because it has an emotive angle to it. And then he says creating awareness through World Mental Health Day and so on. Cooperative efforts with southern states to better handle the mental troubles prevalent. Okay, this is a nice point. And then he says, moves forward and talks about the conclusion. In addition, urbanization and modernization should be sensitive to communitarian values for good mental health of our citizens. This seems to be an overall decent answer, but I'll tell you that it is not up to the mark, and I'll tell you why. There is something that I want you all to notice. If you look at the multi-pronged strategy he has written, it is a multi-pronged strategy to handle the mental disorders as such. It is not talking per se about the regional variations in mental disorders. You were supposed to talk about a strategy which handles the regional variations, because that is what has been asked by the question directly. But what he has done, he has given a strategy to handle mental disorders as such. That might give you some kind of personal satisfaction because you've written so many points here, but these points were not really asked. What was really asked was just this point: cooperative efforts with southern states to better handle the mental troubles prevalent, and you had to extend on these points. And how do we extend these points? You could have an extra point talking about conferences. For example, there are several conferences. You have World Mental Health Day, and there are several conferences and conclaves on mental health every now and then. If these conclaves are conducted more in the southern states, it is going to create awareness in their minds. It is going to create some sense of framework in their mind to improve their mental health. That is another good point that you could have written. Also, how do we address the regional variation? Let us think. What about having schemes? There are several schemes in relation to mental health, okay, and when you have these schemes, you have to tweak the funding component in favor of the southern states, and what I mean by that is that in relation to a mental health scheme, the center could provide a higher percentage of grant, so that these states can handle the mental health care problem they have. Okay, these provisions are good. But they are talking about mental health care as such. So these were supposed to be cut down to just 3 or 4 points, and he was supposed to talk about regional variation and improvement, regional variations in mental disorders and how to handle them by extending this discussion. That is what I'm trying to tell you all. Okay, so this is the question for the day. So there is another surprise for you all. I have another question which is basically a static question, and I want to discuss that particular question too. Like I said, there is another static question I want to discuss for the day, and the question is on local governments. This is a very static question, and this has been in the exams for quite some time. Every year, if you look at the GS2 paper, there is a question on local governments in some form or the other. But then when you get this total topic of local governments in your grip, you will be able to handle the question well. So what is the question for the day? Okay, so the question for the day is the following: local governments ensure that people within a given territory act collectively to ensure their welfare. Okay, discuss and suggest measures to empower the local governments in India. Okay, so this is basically, to my mind, a two-themed question. And before I discuss the two themes, I want to give out certain prerequisites when you write a static question in GS2. The first thing you have to keep in mind is the usage of articles. As far as possible, put down articles, 2 or 3 articles in your answer. If it is a static question, is going to improve the richness of your answer. The second thing you have to keep in mind is the recommendations, ARC recommendations, Punchi recommendations, and any other committee recommendations that you have. Okay. And these two things are basic prerequisites. We will move forward to convert this particular question into into several subheadings that we always do. Local governments ensure that people within a given territory act collectively. So basically what I'm doing is, I'll mimic the nature of the question, and initially I'll address this part. First, I'll talk about how local governments ensure that welfare of people is ensured. Okay, and then the second thing I'm going to talk about is the measures, because he has asked for it, measures to improve the situation of local governments in the country. Okay, so these are the two things that are going to form the basic structure of my answer. And how do I start my answer? I could start my answer by talking about local governments, by summarizing what local governments are. That would be a definitional approach of answering the question. I could also talk about the recent current affairs, if any. For example, some time ago, Delhi government was not able to pay money to its local employees because it didn't have funds. So in this particular context, the governance of local governments can be discussed. I can introduce a current affairs and then give a sense of warmth and move to the body of the answer. That would be the current affairs approach. But definitional form would always be better, because that would actually create a link between you and the examiner, because it tells the examiner that you know what you're talking about. What do you mean by local governments? Okay, and the examiner knows what you mean by local governments. So that part is done. So we have created the structure of the answer. We will move forward and see how this person has answered the question. Okay, so let's see what he does. Local governments are the third tier of federalism. This is a very good introduction, including governments at the district and village level, set up by 74th and 73rd Constitutional Amendments Acts respectively. So this is a really dense introduction. He basically had facts. He's also talking about the federal tier, and he introduced me to the idea of local governments. Okay, so this is a good introduction. So let's see what he does. We said, what were the two subheadings that we decided? The first subheading is to show that local governments ensure welfare, and the second subheading is to show, is to tell them the measures that are required to improve the governance of local governments. Okay, let's see what he does. Local governments ensure local welfare. So this has been out and out picked up from the question. He is mimicking the nature of the question, and he is telling us how how local governments ensure the welfare of the local people. Gram Sabhas have wide powers and perform such functions as determined by the states. Okay, running of schemes monitored through the mechanism of social audit, etc. So through social audit, local governments are able to make sure that the schemes are functioning effectively in their areas. Okay, that's a good point. Gram Sabhas exercise control of panchayats, ensuring fund usage for welfare of locality. Okay, but this seems to be a generic point, but it's fine. Gram Sabhas have powers over a wide variety of subjects like minor irrigation, fisheries, and rural development. Okay, I think he left the point midway. Okay, so that is what has been written. So this is a good point, because these come under basically the one of the schedules, the 11th schedule of the constitution, and he is listing out points from the 11th schedule of the constitution, showing how wide the powers of the gram sabhas are. And because their powers are wide, they have the capacity to make sure that the welfare of the people is ensured. Okay, so this is about gram sabhas in general. Now he moves forward to cover the fifth and cover the schedule areas as well, in which you have the PISA Act, right? In PISA Act, what extra powers do local governments have? They can regulate the sale of liquor, they can regulate the ownership of minor forest produce, and they can exercise control over money lending. Okay, so the points are good. The problem with questions like these is that on local governments, lots of people have lots of content. You have so many points that you could write. You have to stop somewhere, and you can't write generic points like this. And he could have added, right off the bat, I can think of few points that he could have added. For example, he could have talked about the village development plans and how they are integrated successively along different levels of federalism, and they reach the Niti Aayog. He could have talked about district planning committee. He could have talked about metropolitan planning committee. And I want you all to notice something really important. He is talking about local governments, but he is not talking about urban local governments. He should have basically adequately segregated his answer into rural local governments and urban local governments, because the question is not on gram panchayats or jilla parishads as such. Because let's have a look at the question. Local governments ensure. So local governments mein kya aata hai? Local governments mein you have the village local governments, panchayati raj, and then you also have urban local governments, mandals, and district authorities, municipalities, municipal corporations, nagar panchayats, and so on. All these things come under local government. governments, right? But his focus overall has been on gram panchayats. I want you to keep that in mind. So this has been written to show you all that it is easy to get lost or lose track of the actual mandate of the question. You know so many points on topics like local government. If I were to ask you were to ask you about points on urban local governments, you also have points to tell me, but you're not writing it here because you have lost yourself in the flow. You kept on writing and writing about rural local governments. You totally forgot about urban local governments. You shouldn't do that. Okay, let's see what he does next. Okay, see, he has talked about how local governments can ensure welfare, but then there are problems. He is pointing out the problem. So he is trying to create a logical flow from the side heading above, and then he moves to measures to empower local governments. So what I can say is that his side headings are sorted. He has been doing this exercise for quite some time. His side headings have a logical flow, but the points he is writing in there, they need some kind of revision in order to match the actual mandate of the question. So what are the problems that he has identified? Fund devolution by states to the local governments is minimal, first point. Poor expertise of gram level functionaries. Okay, see, here also he is talking about gram level functionaries, but not about ULB. You have to properly democratize your answer. You have to give equal importance to rural and urban local bodies, right? Local bodies don't levy taxes for fear of popular backlash. If I levy taxes, I might not get the votes which I usually get, so I don't levy any extra taxes, so I don't have money. And then casteism, communalism affecting solidarity, poor education, healthcare, and local levels of development. So he basically saying that there are so many ground level problems at the local governments. So in order to handle this, you have to properly empower the local governments. How do you empower them? The first, whenever you talk about empowerment of local governments, you have to keep few things in mind: funds, functionaries, and then the importance of raising these funds through internal resource generation. It is the states and centers can give money, which is all right, but these local governments, in order to meet the essence of the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment acts, they should be able to create this kind of money by themselves. Okay, that has to be kept in mind, in addition to funds and functionaries. Proper devolution of funds by adhering to state finance commission norms. This is a good point. Direct election of mayors can be looked into. This is basically a debatable point, but it is adding value to my answer, because some experts believe in direct election of mayors, some don't want direct election of mayors. Some states, some municipalities do have that, but most of us don't. Ensuring smart city mission and Amrut do not override local governments through special purpose vehicles. So basically these two missions, which are being implemented on a war footing at the moment, they work on the basis of special purpose vehicles, especially smart city missions. These special purpose vehicles override the local panchayats, override the local governance bodies, because these special purpose vehicles have been given extra powers, and the local component representation in these special purpose vehicles has been less. So basically these missions have the potential to have the potential to snub the local governance and the essence of local governance. So this should not be taking place. Secretarial support is to improve the expertise of the functionaries at the local levels, and then you have to boost internal resource generation, both tax and non-tax. And then he says states must repose trust on local bodies with respect to funds and functions. He is mentioning 11th and 12th schedule here. As per principle of subsidiarity, this is a really good point, to properly empower them in letter and spirit. I want you all to go home and look up what principle of subsidiarity is. It is basically a really rich thought. I have read about it in one of the ARC reports. I want you all to Google it too. So what is the evaluation of the answer? The answer overall seems to be a really good answer to a layman. But the point is, while he addressed this part well too, he did not answer this part well, because he is talking more about the rural local bodies. He should have democratized or spread his answer over rural and urban local bodies. Okay, so by making those changes, he would have written a really good answer. So we have discussed two questions today, one static question and one dynamic question based on current affairs. So overall, I have showed you all questions, and I pointed out too many mistakes today. See, overall, if these questions were to be evaluated by the examiner in the end, he would have given decent marks. But the point is, I'm trying to help you all to write the best of the best answers, and which is why my evaluation pattern is going to be a bit strict. Okay, so based on those strict criteria, if you don't meet the mandate of the question, if you don't strictly lie within the mandate of the question, I'm going to penalize you, and that is how I'm penalizing this person. Otherwise, this mistake is all right. This mistake is all right because it is a 10 marker and you have 3 or 4 subheadings, and if in one subheading if you make some kind of mistake, it is quite allowed and it can be forgiven, which is fine. But that is where our expertise lies. That is where we are supposed to improve. If we keep improving day by day incrementally, towards the end what happens is writing an answer in relation to the mandate of the question becomes an automatic process. You don't have to spend time and think about generating the structure of an answer. By looking at the question itself, you'll be in a position to generate an answer, generate a structure, and then it is all about putting down content properly with neat handwriting. Okay, so the discussion for the day is over. As usual, I'm going to put up the question for tomorrow. I'll just read out the question for you all. I want you all to do all the thinking, and if possible, write down the side headings in the comment section, and we will see if these side headings match with the side headings I'm going to give you all tomorrow. Okay, so let's see what the question is. The question is on GS1 society. So this is apparently a static question. So if we do not act in a well-rounded approach to ensure women's access to resources and opportunities, none of us will see gender parity in our lifetimes, nor will many of our children. Explain the statement in India's context, in Indian context. So this is basically a very emotive statement. He is trying to tell you that if we don't take care of women's access to opportunities and resources, neither us nor will next generation will see gender parity. That is what it is trying to say. And how do you convert this question into the introduction, body and conclusion format? And under the body, what are the subheadings that you are going to keep? I want you all to write them down. Let's see if you all write a nice introduction, body, conclusion. I'll try and put down comments on every format of introduction, body, conclusion I get. So please put down your comments on this, and we will see how to handle this question tomorrow with a sample answer, and we'll also evaluate the sample answer and pick holes if possible. Okay, thank you.